Hello, lovelies. Hope you can all hear me okay. Welcome to another Writer Wednesday chat. My name is Katie Phillips, and I'm a writing, craft, and career coach. And I also do quite a bit of book editing as well. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at story structure. And if you're familiar with my manuscript consults, or have done a manuscript consult with me before, we're going to be looking, you'll be familiar with some of these concepts that we're going to be looking at tonight. There's a lot that goes into story structure and making the story work, making the story flow, keeping that tension up so that your reader is engaged in your story and has a reason to keep turning those pages, has a reason to keep on reading. Because as authors, we need to always be aware of the fact that there's so many other things that your readers could be doing and so many other distractions and demands on their time, right? So we want to keep the story moving, we want to keep the story strong and compelling, and never give them an excuse to shut the book or to not turn that page. And that's one of the main reasons why story structure is important. It's kind of the non-sexy part of writing the story. I mean, we love the characters and review and all of that, and there can be this mentality of story structure, it's not that much fun, or it's not that important, or whatever. But actually it is a key component and a key tool that will really help you get unstuck if you've been dealing with writer's block, identify problems with your characters or your story that are going to cause problems later on down the road, and just create a kind of cohesive whole, which will also really help in the editing process and save you a lot of time and energy when you're doing your rewrites. So keep that in mind as well. I will take some time at the end to answer questions, or if you're just wanting to have me kind of troubleshoot a story issue or something that you're dealing with. So feel free to post those in the comments. If you're watching, just pop on and say hi, and that would be great as well. So feel free to do that. Hi, Christina. Nice to have you. Yeah, great to have you. Feel free to post whether questions you might have, or if you want to just kind of workshop some of the story issues that you're dealing with. So glad to have you. Feel free to do that. So if you've watched my previous videos on premise and elevator pitch, those also kind of play into this idea of story structure, because your premise is really your core components of your story. It's your character's main motivation. What do they want more than anything? And plus the main obstacle or conflict they face, what's keeping them from accomplishing their goal or their deepest desire. And then kind of how those elements come together and to create your story, and how they accomplish that. And if you have more comments about that, just go ahead and go take a look at my video on premise. I'll include links to that in the comments when we're done. Elevator pitch is just an expanded version of your premise. Basically your premise plus some setting details and some more information about who your character is and what they're all about. So feel free to pop over and take a look at that if you want some more information about those. But we're not going to dwell on that too much tonight, because there is so much in terms of story structure, and I really wanted to take the chance to delve in a little bit to the main transition points. So the way that I kind of divide it out, or the way that I think about it, is derived from actually screenwriting term, which is the 3-act structure. And some of you may be familiar with that. And while we don't have to, follow it religiously, it's helpful to learn the rules so you know how to break them effectively, because they do exist for a reason. So just real quickly, I'd like to run over those main transition points. So the first one is your inciting incident. If you're not familiar with your term, this is basically where the status quo changes. So this is where they're going along in their everyday life, and you know, Harry gets his Hogwarts letter, or you know, the Frodo's enjoying his nice you know, beer at the pub with his friend or whatever, and Gandalf shows up. I mean, there are countless examples. There are many, many different novels, but your inciting incident is where your status quo changes and the story really begins. Okay. And the next one is turning point 1. And sometimes this is the same as the inciting incident. And sometimes this first turning point comes a little bit after the inciting incident. I personally recommend that the inciting incident should be within your first chapter. Okay. Start the story where the story starts, right? And fill in the details as you need to as you go. Turning point 1, sometimes this is kind of in the first couple chapters, first 2 or 3 chapters. Sometimes if it's a kind of really long epic novel type. But the thing that characterizes the turning point 1 is a decision. Okay, so your character has to make a decision about how to respond to the events that have happened or the inciting incident. And that can be, they have the choice whether to stay with what they know or kind of embark on a new adventure. They have the choice to, you know, let fear hold them back, or to do something that seems a little rash and maybe will take a lot of courage. But this turning point 1 is really how they respond to the inciting incident that kind of catapults them into the story and leads them, it's the first step in their journey to, I guess you could say the first step in their journey to really accomplishing or pursuing their main goal. Okay, so, and that goes back to your premise as well. But that makes sense. Getting some hearts and likes and stuff. Awesome. So this is a really, really key component, because you really only have you have a very, very short period of time. Hey, Margaret. Hey, so glad you're here. I mentioned this earlier, but feel free to post your questions in the comments, and I'll get to them at the end, or if they relate to directly what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and address them. So feel free to do that. So thanks for popping by. But yeah, as I was saying, this inciting incident in this first turning point, whether they're the same or whether they're just kind of close together in those first 1 to 3 chapters, these are super, super important, because there's a very short window of time that you have to hook the reader and keep them going and get them invested in your story. Okay, so this one is absolutely critical to get right. Don't dilly-dally around, you know, trying to set the scene or whatever. It's important to have some context, but as soon as possible, get to your inciting incident and your first turning point, so your reader has something invested, because your character had to make a choice. Okay, so that's inciting incident, that's turning point 1. Turning point 2, I like to call this the messy middle. This also tends to be where people get stuck. So I feel you there if you've gotten a third to halfway through your story, and you're sort of feeling like, what do I do now? I know where I need to go, but I'm not really sure how to get there. Turning point 2 is where you are continuing to make things more difficult for your protagonist, where they're tempted to give up and turn back instead of pursuing their goal. For example, in the Lord of the Rings movies, this is where Frodo decides to go off on his own with the ring to kind of keep it out of the temptation of his friends. So that would be an example of turning point 2. This is where things really start to get real. This is where things start to get serious, and things get really, really messy. And again, it is important that this is a decision point for your character, that it's not just them reacting to the circumstances that they're facing, but that they're being proactive, which strengthens their character. They're being proactive as they encounter these challenges and are trying to solve those challenges. And a lot of times, them trying to solve their challenge actually creates more problems, but that just makes it more fun, right? And continues to escalate the tension. So throughout this process, through the inciting incident, through turning point 1, through turning point 2, we're continuing to escalate the tension. They're facing a series of smaller choices that lead to these bigger choices or these transition points. Okay, so they're continually having to make decisions to deal with different challenges that come up along the way. And you're really using this messy middle part to both establish your story and your characters, but also set things up for your sort of climactic end. But we're not quite there yet. This third one is what I like to call the point of no return. Okay, so technically it's turning point 3, but I feel like the point of no return really captures a little bit better what this one is all about, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. This is where your character, your main character, has to make a decision that will affect the trajectory of their life. And often in the lives of others in a very significant way, okay? So no matter what decision they make, it's going to have a big effect on them. It's going to have a big effect on others. There's really high stakes here in connection to them accomplishing their goal or their primary desire. And this is also the point where it's good for your reader to be able to empathize with your main character to the point where they would understand if they decided to take the easy road or if they decided to quit or whatever, but they're really hoping that they don't, okay? So you kind of know what I'm feeling with that. And this is something that really sets up that kind of climactic final moments, right? Because they're all in. They had the chance to turn back. They no longer have that chance. They're all in. All the chips are at the center of the table. And it just sets up that tension really, really nicely for that sort of climactic final point. Does that make sense? Okay, seeing some likes. Awesome. Any questions about what we've covered so far? Hey, Amy. Nice to have you here. Yeah, like I said earlier, if you have questions or if anything's unclear, just feel free to post in the comments, and I'll address those as well. So we have the inciting incident. That's where the status quo changes. Turning point 1, this is where your character has to make a decision to basically set out on their quest or set out on their journey to accomplish their goal. Sorry, just like Christina's comments. But yeah, so this is where that big decision point comes that really catapults them onto their quest or their journey, whatever that looks like for them. And the inciting incident and that first turning point should be fairly close together. And then you have turning point 2, which is the messy middle. That's making things more complicated. Things have become, there's layers of complexity. That's where you do your world building and dig into your characters and really set the stage and build the tension and set it up so that it takes you to turning point 3, which is the point of no return. Okay. So, and it is really, really important that you don't give your characters an out here, okay? That they have to make this decision, okay? Now, they have the decision or the option to quit or to go back or, you know, whatever. But once they make this decision, there is no going back. Does that make sense? You good? Follow me? Okay. Let me know if you have questions about that. And then so that the whole point of that final point of no return aspect in your story, turning point, if you will, is then to lead to the climax. Thanks, Christina. Glad you're following. And this is also, I have a worksheet for this, and I'm putting it together in a more coherent form. And I'm hopefully going to be offering that as a freebie so you guys can visualize it as well, because I'm a very visual person, so I feel like it's a little bit easier to be able to visualize that too. So hopefully I'll be able to get that out to you guys sometime in the next month or two. But yeah, so we have turning point 1, turning point 2, turning point 3, your climax, okay? Y'all pretty much know what that is. That's where everything kind of blows up, and there's the final showdown with your character trying to accomplish their goal. And then however that resolves, then that goes into your ending. And I should probably do a whole talk about endings, because endings are so hard, and pulling all those things together, and there are many different kind of endings. But one of the things that I want to say in terms of, in regards to story structure, is making sure to connect the points, connect the dots, so that each decision point sets up and leads to the next one. So your point of no return sets up your climax, because they made that choice or that decision and they're all in. Then that's kind of sets the ball rolling to create the events of your climax, so that things happen as a result of your character's choices. Okay. So then you have your climax. Maybe they succeed in accomplishing their goal. Maybe they partly accomplish their goal, but partly create bigger problems. If you're writing a series, this can be a helpful way to kind of structure that ending. Maybe they don't accomplish their goal, but they actually end up accomplishing something different that they discover is more important. So there's a lot of ways to do this. Just make sure and set it up. So, important thing there. So that's how you structure your story. Inciting incident, turning point 1, turning point 2, which is the messy middle, turning point 3, which is your point of no return, and then you move into your climax. So the point of no return and your climax should follow kind of very closely on the heels of each other, or kind of be one and the same. The point of no return leads to the climax, and then however you resolve that, then that goes down into the ending. And that needs to be resolved or satisfying, even if it's not necessarily a happy ending. But we'll talk about that another time. Are there any questions about that so far? What questions do you have in terms of story structure? Are you kind of seeing your story flow in this way, or are there areas that are missing? So I'll give you a chance to put those in the comments. One thing that I wanted to say about this is one of the most common story structure problems that I run into is having too long of an intro. And I think part of the reason for this is that as you start writing a story, and this happens with so many different authors, but they're still kind of trying to get a feel for their characters, get a feel for what they want to say with their story. They're not sure, they're not super confident about the world building, so they're not sure like how much they need to include, how much backstory they need to include, all of those kind of things. And as a result, those sort of a lot of times end up getting kind of dumped at the beginning of the story. And the reason that's problematic is then, it's like when you go to a party and you just meet someone and, you're kind of exchanging small talk and you say, oh, so what do you do? Well, one of the, and then maybe the person that you ask, what do you do? Instead of saying, oh, well, I work as a graphic designer for a marketing company, they launches into this whole long story about this business meeting that they had and the problem they had with their boss and this, that, whatever, and, how it's not actually their dream job, but their dream job is this other thing, right? You'd be kind of taken aback by that. And that kind of is what tends to happen in first drafts. right? Is the reader, they pick up the book, they just want to know, what do you do? What is the story about? What's the main problem? Who is the main problem happening to? Why should I care about them? Okay, and so instead, if they get lots of world building and backstory and like all this kind of stuff, then that's kind of a turnoff. Okay, does that make sense? So that's one problem that I see a lot. Another thing that I see as well is having no turning point too. The messy middle is a hard one. I will just say that straight up. Christina, I totally feel you. I'm writing fantasy and it's finding it hard not to drown the reader in exposition and backstory. It's so hard. Yeah, this is especially hard in fantasy stories where there is a ton of world building, where there is a lot of backstory that kind of factors into it. And it is a balance to figure out how much to include, what not to include, when to include it. I'm actually going to be doing a series of videos on world building. I love world building. It's something I'm passionate about. Cultures, characters. Many of you know that I've been to over 30 countries and I lived overseas for almost 3 years. So that's something that I know well, I'm really passionate about. So I'll be talking more about how do you incorporate world building into your stories, and not drown your reader in exposition, not bog it down with backstory, because it is hard. It is tricky. We're going to talk about how you can do it because it can be done, and it can be done really well so that it creates depth to the story without detracting from the story and in your characters. Claire, great question. So I know that in a series, each book follows the 3-act and each book is also considered an act. Any tips for structuring character goals so as not to feel like you're one-upping the climax of each previous book, if that makes sense? Yeah, that makes total sense. So as you pointed out, and this is actually a great point to do a story structure, is when you're structuring your series, you actually can structure it in a very similar way, because the first book tends to be an introductory book that's removing your character from the status quo, and kind of setting up the main action. Your second book, messy middle, right? Everything goes wrong. Empire strikes back. Things get crazy. Trying to solve these problems, but more keeps cropping up. All of those kind of things. And then your third and final act in your trilogy, if you're doing a trilogy, which tends to be the most common for this reason, is then your climax and figuring out how all those strings kind of come together. So as far as tips for structuring character goals, you actually do want to one-up the climax of each book. So because you don't want the reader to like read the first book, okay, that was really exciting, interesting character arc and all of that, and they could do the second book and feel like they're reading the same book over again. Okay, does that make sense, Claire? So, but the way that you structure your character goals is that you have each goal lead into the next one. Okay, so maybe they reach their goal for the first book, but that proves either to not be as satisfying as they want, or finding the answers to that question or satisfying that goal actually leads to a bigger goal or a more complicated goal, or achieving that goal created unforeseen complications that now they're kind of having to deal with. Okay, and I recommend, there's a lot of different ways of doing this, but I really recommend starting with character when it comes to your plot and letting your character lead to your plot rather than your plot form your characters. Okay, because I feel like it makes it much more natural. So your characters feel like real people and not just sort of cardboard cutouts that you're moving around as you're telling your story. So an aside there. Did that answer kind of your questions there, Claire? Or did you have any additional questions in regards to that you kind of needed clarifying? Yep, okay. If you're needing more clarification on that, just let me know. Margaret, I was going to ask that same question. Does a major story arc kind of follow the same structure of an individual story? Yeah, I mean, roughly, like there's going to be some things that are a little bit different, but there's a reason that story structure works. And so if you follow that structure within each book and then just kind of create it on a larger scale within the context of your trilogy, then that tends to feel really natural and help you get your pacing right and helps that story to kind of continue to coalesce and develop in a way that makes sense and doesn't feel kind of jerky or just disjointed. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question, Margaret, or did you have an additional question with that? Let me know. Claire, sounds good. Just trying to figure out how to escalate things appropriately. Yeah, that is a trick. And figuring out that tension and that pacing can be challenging. And it's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about the structure. Because actually, a lot of times when people have pacing issues in their stories, it actually kind of goes back to the story structure. Either they've diverted from their premise, which I really recommend you go back and look at the premise video if you have questions about that or problems with that. It's either diverted from the premise or they're trying to make their character do something that isn't natural for the character because it kind of fit into your plot idea, right? Have any of you ever done that? How does that work out for you? Not so well, right? So that can be something that comes up as well with that. So Margaret, I'm so glad that answered your question. Let me know if you have more questions about that. Writing series is a little bit of a different beasties, but it does help to kind of stick with that general principle to give you a framework to work from. So great questions. Any other questions? Christina, did I get your questions answered okay? It's not letting me look at all the comments for some reason. So hopefully I didn't miss any of them. Okay, any other questions about story in general? Oh, Christina, okay. When it comes to the messy middle, mine is long, but mostly because of the relationship building between my two main characters. At what point is it too long, if that makes sense? Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, the reason that pacing is so tricky is that you're balancing your character goals and your character arc with your plot arc and kind of weaving them together. And so as your character moves forward in their arc, whether that be a relationship or whether that be their like personal growth, then that should kind of move along the events of the plot as well. And things happen in the plot that then force them to make decisions, which forces them to grow. So those are kind of all interconnected, but that makes it tricky because I kind of have to be moving the same pace. At what point is it too long? That one's hard without reading the book, I'll be honest. This is where I really would advise you to look at some beta readers to start out with and get their feedback. And then from that point also to talk to an editor or a writing coach. Because this is something that it's really hard for us to identify ourselves as writers, simply because we love our characters so much. And we just want to have all of the fun, all of the feels, all of the scenes with them, right? But sometimes don't actually serve the story. And so as far as a practical gauge of that, I would say going back to those scenes and really evaluating honestly whether it's serving the story or whether it'd be better suited to be a character short or something that's just for your own personal use, or maybe a scene that you can use in another story or in another way. Because sometimes the relationship building aspect of it goes on a little bit too long just because we love that part of it and it's important for us to get to know our characters, but it's not actually something that's progressing the story. Okay, so if it's not progressing both parts of the story, both the character arc and the, I guess you could say, the plot part of the story, then look at it and figure out how you can combine those things, okay? So you're not just serving one purpose, i.e. relationship building between your two main characters, but it also is helping to solve a plot problem or escalating a plot problem, and serving more than one purpose. And I recommend this with every scene, with every chapter. Make it serve more than one purpose. And this kind of goes back to the earlier question about how do you include backstory and exposition, right? And the short answer to that is you work it in naturally while you're doing other things. So you don't have a big chunk of backstory, you don't have a big chunk of world building, but you do it in a very natural way, okay? Yeah, that makes sense. Don't want it to be insta love, but not crazy slow burn where it slows down the story. Thanks. Awesome. I'm so glad that that helped. That's kind of the short answer for that question. That is a character question as well. And I'm excited to talk to you folks more about character too, because character is king, and that's the super fun part. So, but yeah, that would be my recommendation as far as a practical gauge for that, is going back and looking at your scenes and asking yourself, is this furthering the story? Is it really doing more than one thing, serving more than one purpose in the story? And if not, how do I condense those, or how do I make it serve more than one purpose? And you'll find actually that sometimes scenes can be combined, sometimes story arcs can be combined, and it may be easier to do than you actually think. One example of this in a book that I edited that you may be familiar with, it's the Destiny's Trilogy by A.C. Williams. And the last one was actually up for one of the Realm Awards this past year at Realmmakers. And it's a space opera trilogy. Fabulous trilogy, great example of how to do this story structure. So I do really recommend it for that. But one of the things that we ran into with the second book, which the second book is always the hardest, I think, because that's the middle, right? Was the original draft started with 2 or 3 chapters that were really more character pieces. And then the beginning of the 4th story, or the 4th chapter, was where they were going into this big fight with this baddie that was set up. Yeah, not too clear, but no spoilers. But then chapter 4 actually started with them going into battle and really kicked off the action, all that kind of thing. And so as the editor, I approached the author and said, look, like I love these character shorts and they're fun and they give some depth to your characters, but it's not something that's really gonna reach out and grab your reader and make them keep turning the pages, okay? And so what we ended up doing is we actually cut the first 3 chapters of book 2 and started with chapter 4. Also because it's a fabulous opening line and I just loved it. And sometimes that happens. And we ended up using some of that elsewhere. Some of that we used for promotional character shorts. Those are always fun. So you can use it for a lot of different things. But it does happen, so don't be afraid to cut a scene if it's a great scene, but it's just not really serving your story. And that goes back to your premise and your structure and all of the things that we've kind of talked about before. Any other questions? Let me know if that doesn't make sense, Christina, or if you think of other questions that kind of are connected to that. Hi, Victoria. Glad you're here. Feel free to watch the replay if you kind of missed what we were talking about, and post your questions afterward, and I'll be popping back on and reply to the comments and see what I can do to answer your questions as well. So, all right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. It was lovely to chat with you. Like I said, I'll be starting a series on world building and character and how those fit together. So I'm really excited about that. Like Christina mentioned, how do you include backstory and exposition and world building without really bogging your story down? That's a challenge. We'll talk about that. Because that is definitely, the struggle is real. Um, and if you think of questions as you're watching the replay, just feel free to post that, and I will go ahead and post a link in the comments that is for my video on premise and elevator pitch, as having that foundation will also kind of help you make sense of what we talked about today as well. So thank you so much. You all are great. I'll talk to you next week.